Well, thank you so much for being here for our afternoon panel, or our late morning panel on energy and infrastructure. I'm really honored to be moderating the panel. I'm Annie Decker. Our first panelist is going to be Sara Bronin, who's a law professor at UConn School of Law. She also directs its Center for Energy and Environmental Law. She's not only a professor, but also an architect and an attorney. She has written extensively about property, land use, historic preservation, green building, and renewable energy law. I will just introduce every speaker as we go along, so let's start with Sara.
Thank you, Annie, and thanks to Professor Davidson and to Alex Burke and to Fordham, of course, for inviting all of us here today. So I just want to introduce a big picture idea here this morning as we go through the panels. And what I'm talking about today is changes in law and regulation that will help us pave the way to regenerative cities, so cities with net positive impacts on their environment. This involves a move from sustainability to regenerativity. Sustainability has been defined in a number of ways, but the most common definition, more or less, seems to be meeting the needs and aspirations of the present without compromising the ability to meet those of the future. When it comes to cities, sustainability means ensuring that the various demands of human activity are met without inflicting any long-term environmental damage. So I know John will be discussing sustainability strategies and how municipalities are best will be equipped to systematize these. Going farther than sustainable cities, regenerative cities are designed to make positive contributions to the ecosystems of which they are a part. They are meant to renew themselves while adapting to changes that happen in and around them. Their role in improving and augmenting existing ecosystems is carefully planned. So what might make a city truly regenerative? And I would encourage you to think of this as different dimensions of human consumption. So first, electricity consumption. One thing that might make our cities regenerative is introducing the idea of introducing more distributed generation. And I'll talk more about this in a moment. Distributed generation that not only produces energy for the users that immediately are connected to it, but also contributes back to the wider grid. A second area might be food consumption. So again, thinking about this as areas of consumption. So vacant lots may be transformed into gardens and farms, providing food to urban food deserts and beyond the locality. Then also water consumption. So water conservation and management plans might be designed not just to meet the needs of, again, the people who are using them, but also to do things like replenish local aquifers. While the call to have sustainable cities has reached a wide audience, I think the call for regenerative cities has really just begun. There's a few organizations out there that are starting to push for this idea. Despite the attractiveness of regenerative cities, many laws currently obstruct their development. So state public utility laws prohibit small-scale distributed generation. Zoning ordinances may prohibit urban farming. Federal water laws may complicate private and local water management. So I wanted to focus today about just briefly on this question of electricity consumption, energy consumption, and the topic at the intersection of energy and land use, which is where we cite our energy infrastructure. So this is an important topic for several reasons. First, it's more efficient for energy infrastructure to be sited close to the end users that it serves. And second, where we site energy infrastructure affects our use of land. So the farther out we site energy infrastructure, the more likely it is that we're creating energy sprawl, which is disruptive to local ecosystems and environments. So there's a question as to what is the right size for energy facilities. And we all know about large-scale energy facilities, usually built in out-of-the-way places, usually a single owner and serving multiple end users. We also know about small-scale distributed generation, so the homeowner who has a solar panel on the roof. But I'm really focused on, and I think the next frontier is really mid-sized generation. So generation that serves neighborhoods, smaller groups of users that might be served by a utility, but more than just the single homeowner. And these are usually users that go across property lines. So what form do these mid-sized projects take, and how might they help a city be more regenerative? So first of all, I think that they should use some form of renewable energy, whether it's solar, wind, fuel cells are defined as renewable energy in some states, geothermal wells. There's a whole range, maybe hydro as a more far-fetched, less commercially feasible renewable energy right now. These mid-sized projects should connect to the larger grid. They should be operable in island mode, meaning they can be isolated from the grid. They should be able to feed electricity back to the grid. And they might take advantage of combined heat and power, which is something that I know Adam will be talking a little bit about, thermal energy. Seen through the regenerative city framework, a microgrid, and specifically a renewable energy microgrid, becomes not just the means to distribute energy to individual users, but also an opportunity to use vacant land to site energy infrastructure while reducing demands on the broader grid and actually contributing to it. While neighborhood microgrids have many benefits, they are prohibited in a variety of states. So zoning ordinances, public utility laws, all of these areas of law, business enterprise law, need to be addressed to actually facilitate neighborhood microgrids. So what does that mean? It means accommodating and anticipating renewable energy installations in zoning ordinances, so actually writing them into zoning ordinances, which we don't really do today. Changing the rules at the state level to require utilities to interconnect renewable energy installations of any size to the broader grid. Allowing microgrid operators to recover the retail rate of electricity from end users, just as utilities do. Allowing for submetering, which is prohibited in many states, and that allows for landlords to recoup the costs of the energy infrastructure that they develop for their tenants from their tenants. So submetering, again, prohibited in many states. And then ensuring the technical feasibility of net metering, which allows for operators of generating equipment to send electricity back to the grid. So Kevin Jones is going to give us many more examples of microgrids. And so I'll leave it at that in terms of describing what they are and what they might, how they might be more feasible. But before I close, I wanted to circle back to the theme of this conference, which the conference brochure tells us the regulatory landscape for potentially disruptive advances of urban government, arising from, among other things, the driving need for sustainability. And what our conference organizers have told us and other speakers have told us is that technology is going to be the driving force behind this transformation. And it's important for me to say that regenerative cities cannot function. They would not be possible without technology. And I mean that in two respects. So one is a technology that allows us to identify needs and identify resources. So to gather the data that tells us how much energy we need, how much water we need, how much food we need. And the second aspect is technology that actually allows us to realize and address the consequences of our compulsive impulses. So, in the case of microgrids, again, the technological feasibility to actually make them efficient and make them positive contributors to the grid. So other ways that we need to address energy consumption through technology, things like smart meters that help us to analyze real-time usage, innovations in renewable energy generating equipment, again, to make them more efficient, enabling neighbors to compare their own energy use with that of neighbors, giving consumers the ability to use phones to manage their individual electronic devices remotely. All of this technology actually already exists, but we have not yet figured out ways to deploy it in the settings, in all settings, and in places where it would actually be very beneficial. And I should say, in a nod to Dorothy, and I know her comments may touch on this as well, that privacy issues remain a concern, and I'm not the right person to address these right now, but smart meters in California are being installed in people's homes, and there's a big movement right now to objecting to that, even though the data that's gathered from that is the kind of data that we're going to need to actually make cities not just sustainable, but regenerative. So just to conclude, the result of this push for regenerativity will, I hope, result in cities that are not only attractive places to live, but in cities that are positive contributors to the environment of which they are a part. So we've talked about energy consumption as just one example, and we'll turn that over to John.
Thank you. And so we have John Dernbach, who's a law professor at Widener School of Law and also co-directs the center. So he co-directs the Environmental Law Center. So thank you very much for being here.
There it is. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here this morning. And as you can see from this first slide, I'm going to try and connect sustainability up to smart law, or law for smart cities. I'm going to try and do two things. One is I want to spend a little bit of time talking about sustainable development. And I'm probably going to say some things, or I may say some things you haven't already heard about this before. I feel a need to talk about sustainable development as sustainable development because in the 20 years or more since the term was first coined, I think we've lost some of our historical understanding of what that term really means. And that historical understanding is actually incredibly helpful to figuring out how to proceed. And then I want to make some suggestions taken from a book I published with about 4 other people in 2012 and talk some about accelerating the transition to sustainability in cities. You've already heard Sara state the iconic definition of sustainable development. But what I think I'd like to try and focus on the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of others, future generations, to meet their needs. And that's nice as far as it goes. But if you unpack the agreements that were made at the Earth Summit and you try and take the texts apart and figure out what sustainable development means, you first need to figure something out about development. And what I'm going to show you in a couple of slides is not something that I had a vision about or represents my own inspiration, but rather is a result of a whole lot of time just studying the texts. Conventional development, we confuse development and economic development in the United States. We often talk about them as the same thing. The international sphere where the term arose, development has 3 substantive components: peace and security, economic development, and social development or human rights. They're all anchored in international agreements that were entered into at the end of the Second World War, or right after the end of the Second World War, and in some cases a little later with human rights. None of those agreements had anything to do with the environment, and most of the way we were thinking about development then had nothing to do with the environment. Now, if you think about how development has worked in cities and out of cities since the end of World War II, there have been some enormous successes. People are living longer, people are better educated, they're healthier, incomes have grown, the economy has grown, a lot of really good things have happened. We would probably understand a lot of that as progress. And so when we talk about development in a conventional sense, it's not an arcane term. It goes to the core, I think, of what a lot of us really care about and hope to achieve in society, or as part of society, or hope society would achieve. But there's a price that comes with that, and it's the environment. But it's not just the environment. When you adversely affect the environment, you hurt other people, living people, and people who are not yet alive, have not yet been born. So there's a price to this progress. And that's what really the term sustainable development was intended to address, the price of progress. So what sustainable development does, in a fundamental way, is it would redefine progress. Yes, we believe in peace and security, economic development, social development, or human rights, but also environmental protection and restoration at the same time. Now, the purposes of sustainable development are really not all that different from the purposes of conventional development. They're human-centered purposes. They organize themselves, as you can see, around freedom, opportunity, and quality of life. Sustainable development is a little different in one respect, in that it has an emphasis on not just this generation, but future generations. And I should say that the quality of life issue is something that is a lot of folks at the local level use instead of sustainable development or instead of sustainability. They'll say, this is what we're doing this about, quality of life. Now, cities can be enormous engines of sustainability. You put a lot of people together and you can make per capita energy use and a lot of other things way, way, way lower than you could otherwise. New York City is incredible in terms of low per capita energy use, partly because you have so many people living so compactly. As Richard Florida has pointed out, knowledge clusters also help because you have a lot of smart people talking to each other, and a lot of cool and innovative ideas can come out of this. But there's some things that are really essential in achieving sustainable cities, and you can see them here in education system, infrastructure, land use, and transportation. I'll give you an example of how it works in the opposite way. In 1900, in the Harrisburg area where I live, the school system was so good it attracted people to the cities. For the last several decades, the school system has been so poor, it pushes people out of the city and out into the suburbs. And the school system has actually become an engine of sprawl in Harrisburg. Now, the key thing here is not the one-sentence definition of sustainable development that so many people aspire for. The key thing here is, what is the action principle? How do we think differently if we do sustainability? And we think differently when we do sustainability by integrating the environment with development. That's the key thing. You can't do development here and environmental protection, restoration there. You need to do them both at the same time in the same process. And there are two real ways of doing that. One, you could say, well, look, we'll consider the environment as we do development decisions. Another way you could do this is we say, well, look, as we make development decisions, we have specific environmental goals. Now, the thing to keep in mind here about these environmental goals, is that there's no iron rule about what those environmental goals need to be. Can they be regenerative? You bet they can. Can they be, well, we'll just keep the environment the same as it is now and we'll try not to make anything worse? Well, yeah, that could work too within the framework. That's something to be decided at the local level. But I at least don't see regenerative development and sustainable development as different. I see sustainable development as a way of doing regeneration if that's the goal that local governments seek to achieve. A little more detail on the process. A lot of the process issues for integrating the environment at the local level are all about planning, as you can see. And substantive goals can be done either very generally or very broadly. You could say, well, we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by a certain amount. We're going to be more resilient. Plan NYC is an example of that. The climate change adaptation plan that the city of New York adopted at the end of last year. And there are certainly other choices. The big thing, though, is that integrating environment and development decisions is what makes smart cities smart, or what makes cities smart. Now, another way to think about this is you say, well, we have other goals as well. We're not just interested in the environment. We have economic development and job creation goals. We want to save money. You can do those things, and that's what one of the things that integrated decision-making begins to unpack, is you can do a lot of those things simply by integrating environment and development decisions. I mean, the easy way to do that for a lot of cities is energy efficiency and conservation. LED lights, for traffic lights, energy conservation in big buildings, something that Mayor Bloomberg was instrumental, I think, in making happen. There's a whole process for this that hundreds of municipalities have employed. It starts with leadership at the top. It's hard to get this in any other way. It's helpful to have some people at the local level who are working at this, either as coordinators or managers. It helps to have a vision, some kind of a process to pull the pieces together and then figure out what to do about them, involving deep public participation. So how do you accelerate the transition? Well, from my book, from about 4 dozen different people and applying this to cities, 4 points. One is it helps a lot to have more sustainable choices. People don't like to be pushed particularly, and if you can make more choices more sustainable, then absolutely do it. Why do people use mass transit here in New York? Because it's easy, it's cheap, it's certainly better than taking the taxi across town or your own car. Better defaults matter as well. It's not enough if 1 out of 10 people use the new cool sustainable choice. We really need to move people en masse in large numbers in a more sustainable direction. So better defaults matters a lot as well. Second thing, law for sustainability. You've already heard Sara talk about some of the laws that get in the way. The big thing to think about here is it's not just about environmental law, it's not just about zoning law, it's about all law. In Salt Lake City, There's a project going on, as I understand it, where a number of local officials are sort of combing city ordinances to find things that get in the way and look for opportunities to make things better. Jonathan Rosenblum, who teaches at Drake Law School in Des Moines, has a very cool project where he has students draft ordinances for sustainable procurement, permeable paving, and the like, and then shares them with people at the local government level and tries to get them adopted. A third thing you need, and I think this probably speaks for itself, is some kind of visionary and pragmatic governance. At the local level, where the environment and the economic and the social pieces are all together, it's easier to do that. People see the connections more easily, to be very sure. And then finally, a movement. And you're seeing this a lot at the local level. One of the things that I've seen over the last 15 to 20 years looking out across sustainable development in the United States is that one of the places where sustainable activities are most robust, most energetic, where there is the most learning going on, where people learn the most from each other, is at the local level with sustainable cities. It's a really impressive piece of work that's being done. There's a lot to be done, to be very sure, but what drives it is quality of life, economic benefits, in a broad sense, particularly when people look at their children and grandchildren, that it's the right thing to do. Thank you.
So we have a preponderance of law professors on our panel, I think, compared with other panels, but luckily all of them are actually concerned with real-life issues and applications. So Sara and John helped us set up some frameworks here, and our next three panelists are giving us some fascinating examples of energy and infrastructure. So we have Dorothy Glancy, who's a law professor at Santa Clara University School of Law. So thank you, Dorothy.
I think we could all agree that smart transportation almost always involves sharing the road. I thought this particular picture was an interesting one because it shows New York City 100 years ago where the horse-driven carriages were trying to cope with these newfangled automobiles. Now, 100 years later, we had an announcement from Mayor de Blasio. He said, "We are going to get rid of horse carriages, period." I don't know if you've been by Central Park, but there's still a few of them parked along the road there. 100 years from now, it's pretty safe to bet that there'll be even more vehicles on the road and more kinds of vehicles. We'll have almost certainly autonomous vehicles. And of course, we'll have those wonderful UAVs, unpersoned aerial vehicles that are all going to require new kinds of infrastructure to help us all share the road. Fortunately, the buttons are not moving forward. No, I'm trying to move it forward. Ah, there it is. Fortunately, we do have intelligent transportation systems, and they've been around for about 2 decades in cities all over the world. This is an international sort of technology sector. And they have been providing smart transportation infrastructure that has really made a good effort toward improving ground transportation. They tend to deal with a combination of sensors, communications, and computers to provide more safe and more efficient ground transportation. These intelligent transportation systems rely on things like license plate readers, toll tags, traffic cameras, fiber optic and wireless communications to traffic management centers. Here in New York City, you have one of the most advanced traffic management centers anywhere in the world. So New York City is lucky. Soon, transportation is going to get a whole lot smarter because coming soon to smart cities will be vehicle-to-vehicle technology. This is a technology that involves dedicated short-range radios, transceivers, that will send data about how a vehicle is moving to another vehicle nearby, and it will be interoperable among all types of vehicles. This is the talking cars that you've seen talked about in the press recently. The reason it's been in the press is that the Department of Transportation announced a couple of weeks ago that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is going to propose V2V as a mandatory safety equipment that will be built into all new cars in the United States. This is a huge change in the transportation infrastructure in terms of the vehicles that are on the road. The V2V equipment, which I'll talk about in just a second, allows the vehicles to communicate with each other a variety of sort of vehicle status information within a range of about 300 feet. That's about the length of a football field away. This information will be traveling at really quite remarkable speed. It will be about 10 times a second that the vehicle information will be transmitted. Now, this infrastructure is very unusual and very different from conventional transportation infrastructure in really a number of ways. V2V infrastructure will, for the most part, exist in and between vehicles. They will be required to participate in this transmission of vehicle data. V2V will not involve any additional physical infrastructure. No asphalt, no concrete, no steel is involved, and it won't require expanded rights-of-way, which are often a big problem for transportation infrastructure. In addition, that vehicle purchasers are going to shoulder some of the cost of the system because they will be buying the V2V equipment, the DSRT radios, when they buy new cars. Because the infrastructure will take the form of information, it will be imperceptible and invisible to vehicle drivers, unless, and of course until, they receive some warning from the system. The vehicle-to-vehicle safety data will operate at the 5.9 gigahertz spectrum of the communications channel, and it broadcasts within about a 300-foot range. The messages or the information that is transmitted is really quite detailed, and what you have, I'm told this works, over here is the safety message set that will be transmitted by all cars in the United States to all other cars in the United States. It's a completely interoperable system nationwide, all makes, models, types of vehicles. And those elements include the GPS location and time, the speed of the vehicle, that is, the exact speed of the vehicle, not whether it is above or below the speed limit, the heading of the car, that is, what direction is it going, the transmission state, is it in reverse, in park, or driving forward. The steering wheel angle tells you whether it's turning or going around a curve. The brake status tells you whether it is braking, a vehicle is braking in front of you, and how abruptly that braking is occurring. There is also the path history, where the vehicle has come from, and path prediction, which is an indication of the direction in which the car is likely to be moving. All of this data is transmitted 10 times a second, and all of these elements of the system are under IEEE standards and SAE standards to completely standardize the technology. And that's what has been going on for the last about decade with this technology, is the standardization of the transceiver equipment that is going to be required in every vehicle. There are, however, still quite a number of uncertainties in terms of policy and planning with regard to this technology. What the US DOT announced was something more like an advanced notice that they are thinking about proposing a rule, because they really don't have all of the elements that they will need to provide. The announcement says that this V2V system is going to be collecting and transmitting information that is completely anonymous, and that the transmissions will stay within the individual cars as they communicate with each other. The trouble is that the anonymity that's promised in the public notice that this technology is going to be required doesn't quite match the specifications for the equipment. And I spent a good bit of time last week working with the specified standardized required interfaces, which indicate that the system is designed to communicate both with the roadside receivers, which is called V2I or V to infrastructure. That is the data in the basic data safety message. This information is also going to be transmitted to roadside receivers as well. There are also plans for this data to also be transmitted to other kinds of mobile receivers which have been developed, and this is called vehicle to whatever. That is, V to X is the short form of that. All of these additional connection elements are a threat both to the anonymity of the information as well as to the security of the system as a whole. And that leads us to some of the other policy issues that need to be resolved. I'm just talking about three of them, beginning with governance. Most transportation infrastructure in the United States is funded either in part or in whole by the federal government. It is often built by and maintained by states and local governments, but much of the financial cost of it is shouldered by the federal government, and the V2V system is a federal project. It's not clear which of these levels of governance are going to control the V2V systems, are going to deal with sort of managing the security and other aspects of the system. We don't even know whether there will be a single entity that will help keep the V2V networks, the ad hoc networks, safe and secure. Drivers are going to be asked to, of course, purchase the equipment that makes this V2V invisible infrastructure possible, and it seems that they ought to have a say in what happens as well. With regard to security, the issues about this problem are probably fairly clear to you. The opportunities for interlopers, hackers, and mischief makers are enormous. Most hackers look at the system and say, oh good, I can make an invisible car and transmit all sorts of terrible data about non-existent automobile accidents. The V2V communications have a security function built into them because they each carry a public key encryption certificate. What we don't know yet is who will manage those certificates. There are really quite a number of security management systems that have been designed, but there's been no decision as to who will run the security management functions, and that needs to be resolved before the system, as they say, hits the road. Privacy is a huge challenge for this V2V system and has been since it was first sort of started and under development in about 2004. There are about 3 ways that the V2V system is problematic for privacy. What's interesting about these problems is that there's, generally speaking, something that can be done in a regulatory fashion about them. The first is that the V2V system is an involuntary system. There is no off switch. Drivers of vehicles who are required to carry this equipment have no way to control the output of these basic safety messages at a rate of 10 times a second. The devices will be embedded in the electrical system of vehicles so that if you were thinking of disabling your seatbelts, this one can't be disabled without destroying the electrical system of the vehicle. In addition, there will be a great deal of extremely detailed, real-time personal information that will be transmitted by this system. The location data and the movement data are extremely valuable to marketers and advertisers who would like nothing more than to target advertising to the occupants of moving cars. In addition, and sort of third, the pervasive availability of this movement and location information being transmitted at a rate of 10 times a second is extremely tempting to law enforcement. I mean, just imagine automatically getting a speeding ticket because your car has transmitted its precise speed, which is 5 miles above the local speed limit. It could be completely an automatic traffic enforcement system. The V2V design has tried to avoid this in a number of ways by making the information anonymous, making the ad hoc networks transient, and information simply not kept or logged. But there is quite a bit that needs to be done in an institutional manner, a regulatory manner, to assure privacy, as well as to provide for security and governance. The smart transportation technology that's involved in this V2V smart transportation infrastructure is a really good example of how it takes a lot of smart law and smart policy to put together a transportation infrastructure that is indeed sort of worthwhile. It's kind of interesting to me that we've been talking a lot the last couple of days about the fact that it's really worthwhile to worry about the soul of the city as well as its intelligence. And so if you're interested in V2V technology, I'd be happy to talk with you about it later. Thanks.
Well, I know I'm terrified, but at least this is not being proposed for bicycles yet. So next up we have Kevin Jones, who's the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow for Energy, Technology, and Policy at Vermont Law School's Institute for Energy and the Environment. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Annie, and thanks, Alex, and everyone at Fordham for bringing us together to talk about such interesting issues. It's a pleasure for me to be back here in New York. I had the opportunity to serve as a Director of Energy Policy for a couple years back during the tenure of Mayor Giuliani, and there's nothing quite like New York. I'm going to talk a little bit about some research we're doing that's ongoing at Vermont Law School. It's going to look at 4 case studies of urban microgrids. And first, I'd like to point out 2 of our JD students in our energy program that are research associates working on this project, Sylvia Bartel and Dan Nugent, who are here with me today. To begin, I'd like to just begin with a couple of quick definitions so we all understand what we're talking about. And interestingly, the topic of energy infrastructure and smart grid ties in a lot to the discussion yesterday on broadband, because a significant component of the smart grid is actually bringing communication and information technology from the utility headquarters to the homes and businesses, and that doesn't exist today. So DOE invested about $4 billion in stimulus funds into smart grid technology, and half of that went to communications technology, expanding broadband across the networks, and in many instances using wireless technology to communicate to the meters at the homes. So the smart grid is all about communications and information technology. A microgrid is essentially a new concept where we try to do something that historically utilities have not liked, which is to create a power island on customer premises that can be connected to the utility distribution system behind a common point of interconnection, and it's comprised of a variety of distributed energy technologies, from things like solar PV, energy storage technologies, obviously loads on the system, and when you do that, you have to put in some intelligent control technology. So the microgrid is a new concept, but it really relates to a traditional concept in the utility world of islanding, which utilities have done a lot to prevent. Today, if you have a solar PV system on your home, or distributed generation as there is throughout the city here, the utility has in the requirements essentially mandate that this technology, when you have voltage issues on the system, immediately disconnects from the system. And the goal is to avoid power islanding or creating a microgrid. So a microgrid really is a distinction, a significant distinction that has a lot of profound differences from traditional islanding issues. The first is ownership. Whether it's utility owned or owned by other entities. There's legal responsibility issues in terms of safety and power quality if it's no longer being managed by the utility. There's all issues around the legality of power transfer. Today we have laws that prevent microgrids from being in place, raising issues about regulatory jurisdiction and obviously investment incentives, although the technologies are pretty much the same. There's actually 4 areas where microgrid development is really beginning to thrive a little bit. The first is rural village electrification. If you don't have a grid, when you create something, it's a microgrid. And there's actually an interesting case study we wrote about in a book we have coming out looking at Haiti and a company, in a not-for-profit, EarthSpark International, that is doing a prepaid microgrid in a village setting. The 2 most common places are actually military bases and university campuses. And the reason for that is that they have, as we are here at Fordham, you have a bunch of buildings compact on one site that's usually owned by the customer, and the customer, in many instances, owns some of its own electrical distribution equipment. The new area where this has arisen, post-Irene, Sandy, and some of our other extreme weather events recently, is to use utility microgrids to provide essential community services following an extreme weather event. And that's one of the cases we're going to look at. The 4 case studies that we're focusing on are the University of California, San Diego, where we have in place probably one of the better examples of an existing utility microgrid. And there the university has worked very closely with San Diego Gas and Electric, which is a leader in smart grid technology. And so we're looking at that case. In Connecticut, and following on what Sara's discussion earlier, we are looking at the output of some interesting laws there where the state legislature and the governor have actually now passed 2 pieces of legislation for grants to organizations to do microgrids. They put out $15 million, I think, in the first, 30 in the second, and they are actually having a number of entities propose how to operate independent microgrids that could operate disconnect from the system for 4 weeks at a time. Hartford is where we're looking specifically at, and they have a proposal to put a school, a senior center, library, gas station, and a supermarket together in a microgrid. We're also looking at the former Navy base in Philadelphia that has a microgrid opportunity there that's now owned by the Cities Economic Development Corporation, and of course New York City. And this is a picture of New York in Sandy, where we had kind of some microgrids operating there because we had part of the city black and some operating because of New York's kind of unique with a network distribution system, but part of the city was underwater. And New York has done something interesting. Governor Cuomo has announced essentially a state grant competition for 10 microgrids, and they've are allocating $40 million to support that. So what are the issues that come up, the unique legal and regulatory issues that we want to look at, and that's the kind of interesting stuff. The first is utility franchise service territory. Once again, if you're on the Fordham campus and you want to do a microgrid on Fordham, that is a possibility, but if Fordham wanted to connect their microgrid to a neighboring hospital, for example, that crosses the street out into Con Ed service territory, there are actually state laws that prohibit that in most states of the country, so we'll be looking at that. There's the issue of power quality and liability, with Con Ed having the responsibility of maintaining power quality here in the city and at Fordham. If someone else is operating a microgrid with multiple customers, then you're going to have liability issues that have to be dealt with. Financing, cost recovery. Obviously, regulated utilities have a very well-developed rate-making process. Another interesting issue is a definition of electric corporation. We went through this when we were deregulating the utilities here in New York, and when you have third-party entities now providing things that look like utility services, are they now a utility themselves? Are they subject to all the same laws of the Public Service Commission? And if that's the case, it's going to probably create some additional hurdles. And finally, one of the interesting aspects we're looking at is ownership alternatives. To deal with some of these issues, the easiest way to manage this would be, maybe to have the city own and maintain the microgrid and provide those services. There are probably some concerns, and other third parties would like to do that, but that would get around a lot of those. Municipalization is another opportunity. Obviously, cities often, here in New York, a lot of people might know, the city has something called the New York City Public Utility Service, NICPIS, in their state laws that allow municipalities to own and manage electrical facilities. And obviously third-party ownership is the final piece. Actually, something I skipped over very quickly is customer data privacy. That's been a big issue in our smart grid research. We actually put together a model utility data privacy policy for the American Public Power Association and its members. And once you go to urban microgrids and you're talking about third-party ownership, there could be real concerns about their access to the data from individual customers within that microgrid, and the fact that they're not electric corporations, they're not regulated by the same state laws. Who's going to be protecting the privacy of the customers in that case? I'll end it there. Look forward to your questions, and just want to put in a plug for a new book we're putting out that's on some of our smart grid research, a smarter grid in your grid, that talks about a lot of the different technologies like microgrids and some of the policies we need to promote them.
Thank you, Kevin. So our final speaker is Adam Reed, who is a research associate in the Law and Policy Group, Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute at the University of Colorado at Boulder. So thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Annie. I actually have a slight correction to make on that. I used to be with that group. I'm now with the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Architectural Engineering as a consultant, but it's a recent change. But if you call Racy and ask about me, they'll say, who, that bum? We got rid of him years ago. I want to talk today about, let's go back one, about distributed renewable thermal energy technologies, which bear a lot of policy similarities to many of the issues that Kevin raised with respect to microgrids. But I think we'll see them in a slightly different context here. But the theme is the same, which is that when you're trying to fundamentally change the paradigm of energy delivery, you're up against a ton of inertia. And that's an interesting thing to think about. First off, what is renewable thermal energy technology? These are technologies that harness the heat emitted by the sun or the planet for useful work. There's an old saying in energy that you don't buy electricity or energy, you buy the things that they do. You don't buy kilowatt hours, you buy warm showers and cold beer, unless of course you're English. So some examples of useful work performed by heat, right? Solar thermal energy collects direct solar insolation from sunshine. You could use that directly to heat hot water, for example, or you could convert it to electricity, as is being done through large concentrating solar power plants. Deep geothermal energy, I won't talk a whole lot about this one, but this is a process for collecting heat from deep within the earth. Again, it can be used directly or converted to electricity. Shallow geothermal energy, which I am going to spend some time on, collects heat from soil or water resources near the surface of the earth. And generally, we only use that for direct use, and that'll be kind of the major focus of my talk today. And then also biomass, burning plant matter to release energy, which can be used directly or converted to electricity. Sara also mentioned combined heat and power, which is a method of taking waste heat from electrical generation or natural gas generation and then using that for space conditioning purposes. Solar thermal, it should be noted, is the preferred energy source of many upstanding citizens. Just saying. Worth your thought. It's good enough for Superman. Let's go one more modifier out, distributed renewable thermal energy, or what I call DRTEs, or dirties. Now, sadly, we also refer to fossil energy as dirty energy, which is why I'm trying to get people to refer to fossil energy as nasty energy, non-solar technology. But distributed energy refers to energy technologies that are physically proximate to end use. So examples are on-building solar thermal, where we have panels, not PV panels, but panels that run a fluid through them that collect heat from the sun and then move it elsewhere in the home. And geothermal heat pumps are also called ground source heat pumps at the building or even the district level. Why care? Who cares about distributed thermal? Can't we just use electricity? Well, a couple of interesting things. First is that distributed thermal energy bypasses the need for a lot of the transmission and distribution infrastructure for heating and cooling in buildings. And that's a big deal. By removing demand from the electricity and natural gas system, we reduce the strain on those systems. Space heating accounts for about 40% of US buildings' energy consumption. So it's the single largest category, according to the Department of Energy in 2011. Water heating accounts for about 12% and space cooling for about 10%. So together, those make up the lion's share of energy uses. Lighting is also a big one, but compared to space conditioning, it's much smaller. They're low carbon. In the case of a geothermal heat pump system, only a little bit of electricity is used compared to competing technologies, or they're carbon-free in the case of solar thermal. And most importantly, and this is unusual for sustainable energy technologies, they're off the shelf. They're commercially available components from mature industries. You don't need 10 years of materials research to make these kinds of systems work. They're very simple. They're not rocket science. Quick, I know, this looks terrible. I'm not an engineer. My background is in medieval history, so if I can understand thermodynamics, everyone can. What's happening here? This is a geothermal heat pump system. We have a fluid here. This is usually a saline solution, or also it can be a glycol solution. It takes cold fluid, it moves it into a loop in the ground. This loop might consist of 3 to 55 loops, anywhere in between. It could be 10 meters deep, it could be 200 feet deep, depends on the size of the building. Once there, it picks up latent heat in the ground because the ground is warmer than the surrounding air in the winter. That warms the fluid up, it moves through a pump, and it transfers that heat to a working fluid that's highly sensitive to temperature. We then use electricity, a little bit of electricity, about 25% that what we would have used to space condition using just electricity, to compress that working fluid. So the working fluid gets compressed, its temperature goes way up, it becomes a superheated gas. The superheated gas then moves into this condenser where it transfers heat into another working fluid that then warms the home through a radiator or through underfloor heating or over an air exchanger. The cooled working fluid then comes back to the condenser. The condenser then goes through an expansion valve. It returns to a liquid state, and then we send it back into the ground. In the summertime, we can reverse the whole process and use it for cooling. Downsides to this. One, this is a very low-grade thermal resource, right? It's not that hot. That's why we have to use electricity to essentially hack thermodynamics to get some real heat out of this thing. The second is that we have to use electricity at all, so it's not an independent system. It's dependent upon the grid. So what are we doing? NSF has funded a team of scientists, engineers, and policy experts at CU Boulder and the Colorado School of Mines to investigate a hybrid distributed renewable thermal energy system that transfers solar energy from panels on roofs to a shallow underground borehole system, what we call a borehole thermal energy storage system. This was inspired by a demonstration and pilot project in Okotoks, Canada, that's just outside Calgary, called the Drake Landing Solar Community. This is a picture of it here. And this almost doesn't do it justice. We were there in the dead of winter about a year ago, and every single one of these panels was covered in freezing fog. Things were completely white. The borehole energy system, which has been operating for about 8 years now, was providing 100% of the heating on a negative Fahrenheit degree day, which is pretty cool. So essentially, we're taking solar thermal panels, we're combining them with geothermal heat pump-like technology, but we no longer need the heat pump part in order to do it. So we're building a new experimental research-grade BTES on Colorado's Front Range to improve the technical performance of the system. We're trying to work with the thermal conductivity of the soil to improve its performance. And because of the interesting nature of NSF's program, they had to bring lawyers on to help investigate market structure and regulatory dependencies for widespread commercialization opportunities, which is pretty unusual for NSF. It's a program called Sustainable Energy Pathways. It's kind of the first of its kind in terms of combining hardcore technical research with social, behavioral, economic, and policy research. A couple advantages. One, a BTS can combine the 24/7 operation of a geothermal heat pump system with the high-quality heat of solar thermal. So we no longer have to rely on low-quality heat in the ground to provide our heat source. We can take it directly from the sun. And we can store energy seasonally, meaning we don't need to temporarily match insolation and consumption. This is particularly important in far northern climates. Already this technology has been used not so much with boreholes, but with large concrete heat sinks in Denmark, which is quite popular. And when you think of Denmark, you don't normally think of solar insulation year-round, but by storing it underground, you really improve the ability to use the technology. Most importantly, from a policy perspective, costs are spread over a district of multiple users, improving access to capital and leveraging economies of scale. A couple systems level advantages, not just for homes and businesses, but also for the broader energy system, are that the energy and carbon savings of distributed renewable thermal energy go well beyond the avoided electricity or gas in their use. What do I mean by that? I mean that contemporary energy delivery systems are astonishingly, mind-blowingly inefficient. If we look at this terrifying chart from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, we can see that roughly half of the energy that we put into the energy system becomes waste heat. If we look at electricity generation in particular, we put in about 40 quadrillion BTUs of energy into electricity generation. We only get about 12.5 quads out. The rest is lost to heat. Distributed solutions can save end-use energy, and they save all of the additional inputs that we would have had to put in to generate a little bit of energy. Energy thinker Amory Lovins famously stated once that in order to get approximately 10 units of energy at the end point of use, we have to put in about 90 units of energy at the beginning of the process. That's how big the losses are. So when we save energy at end use using thermal energy technologies, we don't just save kilowatt hours at the point of end use, we save them at every point along the chain, which creates kind of a multiplier effect for carbon reduction. Sounds great, doesn't it? But it's going to get bad. Buzzkill alert. It is unlikely that a widespread deployment of BTES or other DRTE systems will make any significant progress toward mitigating climate change in the 21st century. It's due to two reasons. One, we still need electricity. We still need lights. We still need to power our computers. We've got lots of other things to do. BTES systems would reduce, but not eliminate demand for that grid-based electricity. And most importantly, we still don't have a coherent or comprehensive energy and climate policy. We have an industrial policy masquerading as environmental policy that happens to include wind turbines and solar panels. But wait, slight good news, BTES systems are highly resilient to natural disasters. Moving a building's space conditioning needs to a locally based buried system provides a measure of energy security in the event of disasters or terrorist attacks on the power grid or the gas infrastructure. It's not a single solution, but it's a potential arrow in the quiver of surviving the next 100 years as the climate gets stranger and stranger. So why doesn't everyone use this technology? One is that it costs a lot more upfront than other comparable technologies, about 2 to 3 times more, even though it's cheaper over the long run. In 7 or 8 years, the fact that it has zero fuel costs makes you recoup the investment pretty easily. The problem with that is that the people who bear the cost of investing in the system are individual home or building owners, and they must contend with the opportunity costs of that money. So what would otherwise be a rational economic decision as to what to invest in for your energy system gets confused with lots of other potential uses of that money. You got to save for college, you've got to pay off the cars, you've got to make sure that the kids get into the right boarding school. If you're a business, you've got to compare the potential costs of investing in that system with the foregone benefit of additional business opportunities from investing that money elsewhere. The other reason is that natural gas is, for now anyway, incredibly cheap in the US, which reduces the attractiveness of these kinds of systems. Electric and gas systems have legacy utility infrastructures that tend to hide their real costs because they're borne by entities that are specifically designed to take on those kinds of long-term costs and large infrastructures. And any alternate paradigm to producing or using energy has to find a way to compete with these sophisticated, long-lived, heavily socialized infrastructures with political power. Urban areas are well positioned to lead the way in these kinds of technologies, both as a contribution towards sustainable energy, And as a resilient strategy against increasingly severe weather events. That's because we have relatively autonomous systems at the urban level that are not connected to rather broken national politics with respect to energy and climate, and access to capital for long-term local infrastructure investment that far exceeds that of individual investors. Successful models for GHP deployment, for example, not SBTES yet, but GHP deployment, have created geothermal utilities of a sort where the ground loops are owned by the city. They're considered utility plant, kind of like wires. All of these entities have access to lower cost capital and make decisions over a longer time frame. The Delta Montrose Electric Association, which is an electric cooperative in Colorado, pioneered this as a means of reducing their exposure on the wholesale electricity market. Alternative structures might simply sell heat surfaces in the same manner as electricity or gas as utility structures, and different cities will likely prefer different structures, public, private, etc. A couple interesting questions that are as of yet unanswered, and this is the end of the talk here, but electricity and natural gas prices and cheap prices for electricity and natural gas tend to reduce the attractiveness of new systems. So the willingness to invest in systems of this nature is directly linked to the price of energy now, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's just the way it goes. Wholesale energy transaction and market structures are also hugely important. The DMEA program that I spoke about on the last slide has recently been derailed thanks to an arcane piece of rate making called a demand charge, which was the way that they were saving all that money by removing peak demand from the system. When the wholesale provider for energy to the Delta Montrose Electric Association removed demand charges from their rate structures, suddenly they couldn't make any money on them anymore, and now they're kind of dead in the water. Also, need for resilient infrastructure in the face of a changing climate will change the attractiveness of these kinds of technologies, as would any impetus to decarbonize the energy system were we ever to take serious action toward doing so. If these sorts of topics interest you and you're interested in exploring kind of the legal aspects of it, we'll be writing an in-depth article on urban law and policy strategies for these technologies in Fordham Urban Law Journal later this year. If you have questions, thoughts, or ideas for collaboration, I work with civil engineers all day. I love to talk to lawyers. Come talk to me. You can email me, adamreed617@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your attention.
I'll ask a quick question, and then we'll open up for public questions. So one of our themes in the conference, which many of you have addressed, is how law provides a barrier or helps to enable the innovations that we want. And so I was going to ask this question in the sense of, if you were czar for a day, if you had to pick one law that you would either get rid of or implement, what would it be? But after this morning's panel, I would say if you were czar for a day, or if you use the participatory politics methods that we learned about and could get community support for either taking down a law or enacting it, what would it be? So just pick one law.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess, to enable regenerative cities, I think really one of the key issues is energy use. So I would say, are we removing a law, or we're
whatever you want? Yes, it could be federal, state, local.
So I think at the state level, to have a microgrid statute, and maybe this is a model law project that we could work on, Adam, and Kevin, and everybody actually on this panel, John, and maybe Dorothy too. We'll all work on it. A model law for state level microgrids that would address all of the package of issues that happen at the state level. I think that's probably would be my choice.
I'm going to cheat a little bit and suggest that a process that identifies the laws that seem to be the biggest obstacles would be incredibly helpful. There is a body of law called the Law of Unsustainable Development. You will not find it in a book. You will not find a text about it. You will not even find much analysis of it, but it's quite real. And instead of writing that book, or putting that book together, just having a process at the local level or the state level or even the federal level identifying the most high impact opportunities seems to me in removing such laws or modifying them would be a step forward.
Well, with regard to the V2V technologies that I was talking about, One of the laws that I think needs to be added is a law authorizing this really transformational, quite disruptive technology. Right now, it's being mandated on the American public through an agency regulation. And it seems to me that there should be congressional authorization and control over a technology that is as widespread as this is. That would be one way of dealing with such issues as security and particularly privacy.
Being a fan of public power and municipalization, all the laws that get in the way to allow cities to generate, distribute, and provide their own power to their communities. But probably a close second would be all the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry that our laws are handing out, because that is probably the biggest problem that we have.
I would echo what Kevin said, in effect allowing more municipal and public-based projects to be able to provide power, which was a battle, sadly, that was lost in the mid-1940s and kind of the late 1930s to private industry. That said, the second best thing would be to charge the regulatory agencies that regulate those private industries in power production in particular, to regulate them with a mind toward sustainability and not just toward cost reduction as they were initially constituted. The regulatory structures of public utility commissions and public service commissions are horridly out of date in this sense, in that they are not even permitted in most states to consider environmental quality and future sustainability.
Okay, fascinating. And for those of you who are thinking about drafting local laws, there's a group called ALICE that you might have heard of that I've done some work with, and I recommend to people. They often enlist students in helping to draft ordinances and state laws to provide a sort of counterpart to the ALIC organization. So you might want to submit your ordinances there. All right, so let's open up to questions.
A B2B question for Professor Glancy.
Yes.
Putting aside the potential merits of the technology and focusing just on the potential privacy train wreck that it sounds like, if public key cryptography is being used to do authentication and so on between vehicles, isn't it by definition not anonymous? I'm curious what technological steps have been made to circumvent that obvious issue.
Well, that's the role of the certificate management systems that are being developed. Those certificates are issued in groups in kind of random order and then transmitted to the devices. They haven't decided how they will be transmitted to the devices, but they're talking about using a randomly changing MAC address as well as randomly changing certificates for a really pretty good practical anonymity in the system.
The cars themselves would be changing certificates while they're in motion?
No, the cars are issued between 10 and 200 PKI certificates. And that's done at one time, whether that's once a month or whether that's done once a year. Those are issued and are carried by the vehicle. But the DSRC transceivers are built so that their MAC address, their IP address, if you wanted to look at a correlate, changes every 3 minutes. And so that makes them more difficult to sort of practically track from one set of transmissions to another.
I'm not convinced that a government agency couldn't do that correlation, but perhaps it's good enough for the county.
The government agency, I'm quite sure, could do that correlation.
Basis, but to really do sustainable design and to is more of a regional issue in general versus a local issue. So how do you deal with kind of coordination to be able to move these efforts forward?
Well, the short answer is yes, that is a hard question, and the short answer is you have to spend a lot of time and energy on it. I mean, some of the most interesting stuff, as you well know, I think, is the regional, sort of the regional effort. But the challenge we have, for example, in Pennsylvania, is even trying to get all the municipalities in the Harrisburg area to talk to each other is really, really hard. So it's a lot of process. The only other choice I think you have is to get changes made that consolidate local governments into larger units or consolidate functions so that there are fewer local government units. And I mean, I don't think I probably have to tell anyone in this room how hard that is. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, in Connecticut, we have an issue with that because every single inch of Connecticut is incorporated. And so, again, just echoing what John was saying, we used to have counties, and I think that may be one area where other states have some opportunities. But in our state, we now have nominal counties, but we have no county government and no county government infrastructure and no means to convene the cities that are within the various counties. So it's a really difficult problem.
I'll just chime in with an interesting factoid from a recent study from NOAA on solar and wind availability for a 100% renewable U.S. electricity grid, which essentially found that in order to match up peak loads on the East Coast with peak generation times in the Southwest and on the West Coast, it would require a national superhighway power grid. The fact that we do not have any such thing now and that the U.S. is comprised of some 3,000 plus electric utilities gives you a sense of just how daunting the regional issues are. And it's an even more difficult space to work in because it tends to be managed by the utilities themselves, which tend to be staffed by people who are about to retire and just don't want to think about the problem.
Just another B2B question here. I remember when electric vehicles were beginning to become popularized in the mainstream just a few years ago, one of the big questions was, should automakers standardize some of this technology so that it makes it easier to roll it out and scale and reduce cost or scale? Or should we allow automakers, or encourage automakers and other providers to compete on some of this technology, everything from charging technology to battery technology, et cetera? So with the vehicle-to-vehicle technology, have automakers pushed back or third-party manufacturers pushed back on the standardization of this as a inhibition to future innovation in this area? Or is everyone getting on board and saying we need to set a standard now and commit to that for the foreseeable future, because it's going to take at least 10 years, if not more, to get all the vehicles on the road to have this, unless some great aftermarket product comes out where everyone can just slap one of these things on their existing vehicle?
This was a technology, the V2V technology, where the standards were developed first. And in addition to those technical standards with regard to the equipment itself. And they are pretty much set now. The automakers cooperated with the federal government in a really remarkable sort of co-regulatory fashion in doing this. Some of the standards are IEEE, some of the standards are SAE, and the SAE standards tend to be more reflective of the automobile makers. So the equipment is highly standardized, and that doesn't mean that there wasn't pushback from the automobile manufacturers, but it's probably better for the kind of collaboration. What was interesting in working with that process was the fact that the automobile manufacturers can't cooperate too much or they're in violation of the antitrust laws. And so what the Department of Transportation did was to create an umbrella under which they could legally cooperate and standardize this equipment. The equipment is not only standardized, it's been tested, as we say, in the wild. Any of you from Ann Arbor, Michigan? Because over the last couple of years, we've had about 2,800 real-world vehicles, buses, cars, trucks, all different kinds of vehicles equipped with this equipment, and it does work in real-life environments, at least in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Does that help with with the standards. What I find so interesting about this system is that it seems like it's been way under the radar, and that people should know about the fact that within this decade they may well be required to buy a car with a piece of equipment that they cannot turn off.
So I have a follow. Oh yeah, please go.
So in New York City, there were like 11 fatalities.
I think we're talking about the pedestrian fatalities?
Right.
Yes.
So, I've given it some thought. I think it's a regional problem.
Yes.
I mean, where you have Governor Christie backing up traffic in New Jersey. I mean, I think an accident that happens on West End Avenue in Manhattan is related to rush hour traffic that's coming over the GW Bridge. I mean, it's all related. And without being facetious, maybe we do need a czar, and that's where we should be focusing our, political attention. But in Europe, for example, if you speed on any of the roadways in Europe, at the end of the month, you get a ticket with, it could be thousands of dollars. Every mile an hour you go over the speed limit. And the people who speed know this. I mean, you're basically paying for the right to go over the speed limit. And, that's not a bad thing, because I think it would save lives in the long run if we regulated speed, and people basically would give themselves, they give themselves a pinch. I mean, cars could be designed to not go over a certain rate of speed, and if you're going to speed, you're going to pay for it. And that's one area where I actually think I'm willing to give up my privacy rights. I don't care if the car knows how fast I'm going and reports it to the police. I mean, it's my decision now at that point.
Well, there are people who make that decision, but in this country, a democratic society, people are supposed to be able to make up their own minds about whether they want to be tracked as to where they are and how they're speeding. And that's why there is some opposition to this. With regard to the pedestrian accidents, this is something that's really interesting and is very related to law. The fact is that those accidents are mostly caused by failure to yield by drivers to pedestrians. But the laws with regard to criminal vehicular negligence, those statutes really are very, very easy on drivers, and it's a very low-level crime and often a misdemeanor in those cases. But the technology that's involved, the DSRC technology that's involved in the V2V system, would allow pedestrians to also wear devices. It's sufficiently miniaturized at this point that pedestrians can wear devices that emit the DSRC signal as well, so that they are less likely to be run down by a V2V equipped vehicle. So the safety functions of this system are really very clear. It's not just catching speeders, but the Department of Transportation projects that 80% of the vehicle crashes that occur in the United States that are not due to impaired drivers, drunk driving, drug driving kinds of cases, 80% of them would be permitted by the use of this V2V technology. So the safety benefits of it are really quite remarkable.
Well, let's follow up on the privacy point. So Dorothy is in some way setting us up for our afternoon panel on surveillance.
I'm trying.
Yes. But what about the other panelists? Do you see are there any privacy implications in what you're observing?
Yeah, I mentioned the fight against smart meters in California. So, utilities are requiring people within their jurisdiction to have a smart meter that reads people's usage and in real time and allows them to monitor and then allows them to track the kinds of peak loads a little bit better, but also enables things like getting the utility bill that says what your neighbors are using and how that compares with what you're using, and not necessarily naming specific neighbors, but says, you are in the bottom 10 percentile in your neighborhood in terms of energy use. You're in the top 20 percentile, whatever it is. And people are standing out in their yards and physically preventing utility company operators from going in and exchanging their old meters for the smart meters, saying, this is a violation of property rights, but this is a violation of privacy rights as well. So it's going to be, I think, a big fight, and maybe our audience member here is happy to give up his rights, but a lot of people are not.
And in terms of utilities, I mean, I don't, the smart meter issue, I don't think the bigger risk is the utilities. I mean, there's a long history of utilities managing sensitive customer usage data and state regulations that have protected people's privacy. But the challenge becomes when we have systems like what's called the Green Button Initiative that DOE's and the federal government's promoting to make it very easy for people to download their data from the utility system to an app or to hand it off. You download the data and hand it off in some other way. And I think a lot of people don't understand that there hasn't been the education for people to understand that once it goes to a third party that they don't have the same kind of protections that state law and the utilities traditionally have provided in that area.
I just wanted to add that the smart meter system in California, since I live in California, you can have an electrical connection without a smart meter, but it'll cost you $200 a year. To opt out of the system. And so the penalties for not participating in the data exchange are really quite large.
Just the one quick thing I would add is that the our friends on the right, many of them have been fighting against sustainable development based in part on a view that sustainable development is the new communism. And if you think I'm kidding, you need to spend about a minute or two on the John Birch Society website. These are the folks, when I was a kid, that were fighting communism, and now they're fighting sustainable development, and they have all sorts of videos and whatnot. And one of their arguments is that smart meters is a new version of Big Brother. And so the privacy issues, if there's a serious group of people that buy into that narrative. And so for me at least, resolving the privacy issues is not a small thing or an incidental thing. It's quite real.
Interesting question. I, to my knowledge, it's not been addressed, but the easements that allow utilities to install meters on your property are usually defined according to decades or even 100-year-old statutes or city ordinances in many cases, and it's totally unclear whether those easements, depending on the language that was originally used to craft them, would include the transmission of the kinds of data that's being transmitted. So if ever you were interested in authoring an article that certain industry members would pay to have you not publish, one to do some work on.
So I think
One of the interesting reflections of precisely that point is that the smart meters are located directly on top of the existing dumb meters to be able to use that same easement. And they think they've got a good case, but that's just California. That's not everywhere.
And we got to remember, I mean, the utilities, their responsibility is to provide reliable electric service. And if a customer doesn't want electric service, they always have the ability to say, no, you can't come to my property and collect that information. But the reality is, the smart meter, all it's doing is collecting data about your usage in a manner that actually allows both the utility and the customer to better manage and price that data. So I think the privacy issue, obviously people have gotten worked up over it, but the privacy issue in terms of utility use of that data is, I think, way overblown because we've had very good laws in place across the country, and utilities have been very good stewards of the customer's data. I think it tends to be people that are proposing and opposing technologies for other reasons. But I think the utility protections have a long history of really working and serving the customer in that area.
Okay, well, I think on that note, we will end and go have lunch, and we're going to have a book signing over lunch, so I hope everybody stays and actually purchases some books if you want. So see you at the next panel.
Thank you.